Brian was the finalist.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you all so much for being here this afternoon for our 22nd annual Wan-Lin Kiang Endowed lecture. This lecture series was established in 2001 by Amy Kiang. Thank you, Amy, again so much for bringing us together to celebrate the memory of your husband, and also to bring in important scholars and other thought leaders on China, Chinese society, history, culture, and politics, so that we can reflect on the interconnections between China and the world, China and the United States, China across the disciplines. This lecture is being hosted this evening by the Long U.S.-China Institute, which is a campus center that spans social sciences, humanities, arts, law, and a number of other schools that I'm forgetting right now, but a whole kind of campus enterprise is represented. So I'm really thrilled that you could all be here this evening to join us for this endowed lecture in this very special occasion. I am Bill Maurer. I'm the Dean of Social Sciences here at UC Irvine. And my job is basically to set the vibe, give a little benediction, and then introduce the director of the Long U.S.-China Institute, Professor Emily Baum. Professor Baum is a historian here at UC Irvine in the School of Humanities. Her first book was on understandings of madness in 20th century China, sort of insanity psychology and the emergence of psychiatry of insanity in China in the 20th century. And she is currently at work on two new books. One is called Needled, How Acupuncture Got Alternative or Became Alternative or something like that, looking at the global diffusion of acupuncture, and then in particular, its arrival into the US and its reconceptualization as a kind of complementary and alternative medicine. And the next book is called Uncanny Something. Did I write it down? Uncanny Beliefs, on the history of superstition in China and the intertwining of superstition with politics, power, authority, attempts to stamp things out, attempts to let things flourish. And we very much look forward to those books, which maybe one day will be the topic of a Kiang lecture in the future. So again, welcome. Amy, thank you so much for your generosity. And Professor Baum, I invite you to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dean Maurer. You can always tell how important someone is when they get not one, but two introductions. So I'm happy to be giving the second introduction tonight. So I have the distinct honor of introducing our speaker, Barbara Demick. Barbara Demick was previously the bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times in Beijing and Seoul, as well as reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, where she was stationed in the Middle East and the Balkans. Now, if you're familiar with Barbara Demick's work, you'll know that she is not only a very hard-hitting investigative journalist, but she is also an intensely empathetic storyteller. Her reporting has taken her to parts of the world that to this day remain little known and very much understudied, but she has a way of neither romanticizing nor exoticizing them. She focuses on the everyday humanity of the people who live there. Her first book, Nothing to Envy: Ordinary Lives in North Korea, was a finalist for the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award, and it was the winner of the Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction. A following book, Eat the Buddha: Life and Death in a Tibetan Town, has been called an exemplary piece of storytelling and an eye-opening work of narrative nonfiction. And now she is back with her latest book, Daughters of the Bamboo Grove, which is the subject of the talk tonight. Now, if you haven't had a chance to read this book, and I highly recommend that you do, I will just say, and I'm not going to spoil the book because we're going to hear more about it, but I will just say that it is a truly devastating portrait of the legacy and the aftermath of the one-child policy in China. But what I found so effective about Barbara's writing is her ability to really humanize a place and a policy that otherwise, I think, to our sensibilities would just feel incomprehensibly distant and incomprehensibly foreign. The book is not just a journalistic expose, although it is certainly that. It has lots of moments of journalistic objectivity, but it's a book in which you really start to develop a kinship for the people who are being described. As you get further into the story, you gradually come to realize that Barbara has become not just a narrator, but also a protagonist, and she handles both roles with great deftness and clarity. It is a truly powerful story. It is epic in its scope, but intimate in its details. And again, I highly recommend that you pick up a copy. We do have copies for sale. You can purchase one using Venmo. And if you happen to have a copy on you, or if you buy one, Barbara has graciously agreed to stick around after the talk to sign copies. So I encourage you to get one. Please join me in welcoming Barbara Demick as this year's Kiang lecturer.
Thank you so much, Emily. Somebody who writes about madness and superstition, you'll see there's quite a bit of that in this story. Really, it's an honor to be here, and everybody always says they're humbled, but I really am humbled because I'm a journalist, not an academic. And I know this is normally an academic lecture. Thank you for sponsoring it. It's also sort of strange because this is a story about twins and separated twins. And this is kind of often sounds like a cheap plot device. Separated twins are, sort of plots from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night to The Parent Trap. It's always like, oh, separated twins, they're sort of clickbait. And so when I started working on this, people were saying, this is not a very serious subject, but I am going to try to make it serious and tell you why I pursued this story for, well over a decade. Well, I think Emily said this better, but it was through these separated twins, one Chinese, one American, but genetically identical. I felt like I sort of gained a window into what makes us Chinese, what makes us American, what are some of the cultural differences that shape our identity. And I also saw, because I got to know the families of these twins, some of the misunderstandings, the common misunderstandings between Americans and Chinese. And this story, again, I reported in this, it was mentioned 7 years that I lived in Beijing and subsequently. And it starts with the one-child policy, which I think most of you know about. But from basically 1980 until 2015, China had a policy known shorthand, the one-child policy. And this was really the most draconian regulation of childbearing in modern times. It limited most families to one child with a myriad of exceptions that were so complicated you would have to consult a lawyer between jumping into bed, because if you were this or that or had a military, blah, blah, blah. But it was for most families, one child. And this became China's really national policy. And it was very, very harshly enforced. Emily, if you want to put up the first slide. Do you want to stand here with me? Does that?
Probably figure this out once we. So is this where you wanted to start?
Actually, it was the one before, but that's okay.
The next one?
No. Yes. Okay. And then maybe you should stay here.
I'll stand off.
You want to pull up a chair?
It's fine.
Or I can do it myself. This is forward, backwards.
Yeah, I think you can just click on it and it should move forward.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is the one-child policy, and it was, hailed as this beautiful thing that China would raise healthy, well-educated, well-cared for, well-fed, rosy-cheeked boys and girls. I say boys and girls because there was a lot of propaganda, according to this, of girls were as good as boys. And this was, this sounds very weird, but this grew out of an era that you may remember, if some of you are old enough to remember.
Microphone.
Some of you are old enough to remember the population bomb. Do you remember the population bomb? It came out in the 60s, and this was, the world, we're all about to perish from malnutrition and overpopulation. And this was an idea of the moment. A friend of mine who wrote a book about this called it, it was like sideburns and bell bottoms. This was the 60s. And China came to embrace this idea that the key to building the economy was reducing the population. And it was a little bit of a mathematical sleight of hands, because if you wanted per capita income to be higher, you had to have fewer capita. Anybody has math here? You have like the denominator is the capita. And they pursued this policy with such a vengeance. Sometimes the Chinese government does things brilliantly, and sometimes they really get out of control. And they got out of control with this. They built an apparatus known as family planning. It's kind of a euphemism to family enforcement. And it was brutal. They had up to 83 million people working in some capacity in family planning. That's like more than the People's Liberation Army. It's huge. And the enforcement was really unusually cruel. Families who violated the policy would be fined varying sums, 5, 6, 7 times their annual income. They could, if they were urban people with jobs in the civil service, state employees, they could lose their jobs, their apartments. If they were rural people who had less to be taken away, family planning officials would vandalize their houses, demolish roofs, demolish whole houses, confiscate machinery, confiscate farm animals. And at some point, they started confiscating babies. I will go back to the map here. Nope. It's not this here.
Well, just because we're going back, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, they started confiscating babies, and there was a reason for this. Starting in the 1990s, China opened up to overseas adoption, and this was a very lucrative business. I mean, it was really well-intentioned, and I think the people who started the overseas adoption, really had the best of intentions of getting the orphanages in better shape, getting abandoned babies, better homes, improving relations with the US. I think it was very idealistic, but the policy had led to the abandonment of many, many baby girls because under the Chinese system, the boy in rural China, the boy was the one who would take care of the parents in their old age, and the girl would marry out. She would marry and take care of her in-laws' parents. And there was not much of a social security net, no retirement. So this is what happened. So they started confiscating babies, and this happened, I believe, beginning in the late 90s. And what had happened was that China in the 80s and 90s really did have a lot of abandoned babies. But by around 2000, China had become much wealthier, and families didn't want to give up their daughters. And under the adoption system, each family, each child who was adopted would, the family would, the adopting family, often Americans, others, Europeans, Canadians, Australians, would handle most of the paperwork through Beijing. And I never found any evidence of corruption in Beijing, I must say. But locally, they were supposed to make a donation of $3,000 to the orphanages. These orphanages were part of social welfare institutes. They were government run. And this was a lot of money. And this was what kept the system going. So anyway, the families who lost kids were mostly in very rural parts of China. The adoptions and the abandonments, if you look at the map, for those of you who are not China hands, Hunan, Guizhou, Sichuan, Zhejiang, Guangdong, sort of south central. I mean, this was happening all over the country, but this is where the adoptions were taking place. And for me, I moved to China in 2007, and I actually knew a lot of people who had adopted from China, and it has to do a bit with my age, but I was, one of these women, my cohort of women my friends were mostly well-educated, had this idea that women could do everything. We could have, careers and babies and this and that, and a lot of women delayed childbearing until their late 30s, and oops, there was the biological clock, and they couldn't get pregnant. So there was this huge movement in the US to adopt. Not so many adoptable babies because abortion had been legalized by Roe v. Wade. Single motherhood had become more respectable. And Chinese adoptees really became the adoptees of choice because the Chinese mothers, mostly rural women, were pretty well fed by this age. They tended not to drink and smoke. They seldom had obesity or gestational diabetes. They were young and healthy, and their babies were very appealing to foreigners. So I'll try to move forward. Emily, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
That's backwards.
That's
Forward. That is forward. It's here. We missed one, but that's okay.
Oh, okay. No.
But how do we move? Anyway. So I started working on these stories in 2008, 2009. I had been in China for about a year. And this was a really magical period to be reporting in China. In 2008, Beijing hosted the Summer Olympics. And in advance of the Olympics, they decreed that journalists could go wherever they wanted, except for Tibet. That's another story. But foreign journalists were really allowed to move around the country. In the past, you had to get permission to leave Beijing. So we had this new freedom to roam around, and it was fantastic. It was a great period to be a reporter in China, and we went everywhere, into villages that we would have never seen in the past. So this was a family in Guizhou. It's a village called Tianxi, Heavenly West, basically. And this was a very, very remote village. Is a very remote village. You had to get there by hiking up this goat trail. At one point, you had to, use your hands and knees to get up. Sorry. I think I have another. Nope. Sorry. This is a picture of the entrance to this house. This was not an ethnic minority, but they lived like people in the mountains, in these very crudely built houses that were like matchsticks. And if I can go back, Emily, can I ask you to do the slides, because this is just too,
Yeah.
we can go back to a slide.
That's fine. I think if we can just use the arrow key
Yeah.
to go back.
That's not it, no. Here, this is the one. This family, as you can see, had 3 daughters. There's one who's not pictured here. And then the father got a vasectomy, basically on orders of family planning. But right after he got the vasectomy, they realized the wife was pregnant again. And family planning started hassling them to give up the child. And it's just amazing that officials could get to this village, which was very difficult to reach. But they bided their time well, and they came when when the mother and the baby were alone. The other kids were at school, the father was out, and they took the baby and told the wife this was allowed by law. It was not. The father actually tried to slit his throat with a kitchen knife, and they never got the baby back. Almost everybody in this village knew somebody who had a baby taken. This was, I think, 2002. This was the period, this was the period when the confiscations happened of the thefts. And, normally nobody would have known about this, but there was another thing that was happening in China in this period, which was social media. QQ had started, I think, in '99, and it was the sort of the precursor to today's WeChat, which everybody in China uses. And there was also Weibo that started in 2009 and people from these remote villages, even though most of the older adults were illiterate, there was always somebody in that village who had like a son or a nephew or somebody who was educated and had gone to the city and had a computer, had a smartphone, and they would put a complaint on social media saying, they're confiscating babies from our village. And then journalists would pick this up. We always scanned social media. We had to move really fast before it was removed by the censors, but we would pick up these stories. And these people whose babies were taken, and if we can do this correctly, forward, were very poor. This woman was a grandmother in Hunan province. She was babysitting her granddaughter, not this one, and family planning came late at night when she was alone and grabbed the baby. She wouldn't let go, so she went with them to the office, and she sat there for 2 days on a hard bench with the baby until she finally gave up because the baby was hungry, and they took her hand from behind to put her thumbprint on the documents relinquishing the child. It's funny, when I wrote this, I said, elderly woman, she was younger than I am now, but she'd had a very hard life. Next. Nope. This is a guy named Lee, and he, also you can see the interior of his house, very poor. He was sort of dressed up in my honor when I went to interview him. His daughter, who was a firstborn child, was taken also from the grandparents. They always picked on, they'd find a reason to pick on families. And in this case, this was very common. The parents had gone into the city to earn money as migrants, and they left the babies with grandparents. This was very common. And the grandparents were not as able to resist. Anyway, this little girl was taken. The family was devastated. And they kind of made a mistake with this guy because he was, although not educated, he was really persistent and really brave and pretty smart. And he figured out like what had happened. And he started writing petitions, organizing petitions. Some of you will know what these are, but in the Chinese system, when you're wronged, you traditionally would write a petition to the emperor. This was a petition to higher ups in the Communist Party saying, we've been wronged. And this guy began to organize a petition drive to get back children. And he also realized that other parents in this part of Hunan province had similar experiences. And again, they'd always find something with the family, like he and his wife was some years younger, were not legally married. People would, have a wedding banquet and, be married. Traditionally, it was sometimes very difficult to get the documentation if you were from different provinces. And, at this period, this was, the early 2000s, people were migrant workers in the cities. They would meet people from other provinces and, get married. So this guy was a real troublemaker. And this is the last page of the petition. You can see that some of the parents signed with thumbprints. Some were literate, some were illiterate. But they were angry and they were not going to back down. And again, this is, an age of emboldenment. So I heard about another family through this petition, and this family had twins. And I went to yet another very remote village to interview them. To get to this village, you had to walk across a little log bridge. This is in Hunan. The village is near Shaoyang, sort of a second-tier city. And this was the entrance to the village, not easy to get to. All of these villages, again, by design, remote, poor, no guangxi or connections. And these people, as I said, had twins. And this is actually a video. Can I play this?
Sorry. Yeah, it's okay. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Oh, it's not working. No, the sound is not working, but.
Let me turn the sound off so that we can, there's another video I really want to show you.
Well, I think you might mute yourself if you turn the sound off. But.
Okay, maybe we can figure this out because there's one I really want to show you. Anyway, this family, this is the surviving twin or the remaining twin. She was 9 years old when I visited them. Her name is Shuangjie, and she was living in this really log cabin with her mother. You can see the poverty here is quite apparent. And she told me in a very cute voice that actually you can't hear because you don't have the audio, but she said, my twin sister was stolen. I wish she would come back. I want to play with her. We could wear the same clothes, blah, blah, blah. Cool people in school, blah, blah, blah. And the mother said to me, they were very nice people. The mother, told me her whole story. So this is the mother of Zhanhua. This family, kind of, I don't know, is anybody typical, but they were sort of a typical young couple. They'd had, when they first got married, they had, their first baby was a girl, then they had another baby, a girl, and then they were kind of happy with their daughters, but the paternal grandfather was like, you've got to have a boy to do the cemetery rituals, blah, blah, blah. You've got to keep trying. They didn't really want to, but she got pregnant again. She was huge. She was convinced she was going to have a boy. She was hiding from family planning. And so she spent her latter month of pregnancy and gave birth in a shack in a bamboo grove. That's how you have the daughters of the bamboo grove. And they had actually built this bamboo grove to protect the pomelos. They were also raising pomelos, two pomelos. I like this picture because it kind of looks like two twins, but well, you know what happened. She didn't have a boy, she had two more girls. And the family was actually kind of pleased because the father, who's really an unusual guy, really liked girls. And he was like, and he kind of like wanted to like kind of stick it to his father. He was mad at his father for pushing them. And he was like, ha, look, now we have 4 daughters and we're pleased because he liked girls. He's an unusual rural guy, doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, very soft-spoken. I said in the book, if he had lived in Scandinavia, he would have been the stay-at-home dad because the mother is like really tough, but the father is like very gentle. So they thought, oh, good, how are we going to hide these girls? And so they left one of the twins with an aunt and uncle who lived in the same village because they figured if they split them up, it wouldn't be as obvious that there were two more babies. This didn't work. It worked for about 1.5 years, and family planning found out that this little girl was there. She was about 1.5 years, almost 2. She started like wandering around the streets. People kind of let their kids go free range in these villages. It wasn't like there was any traffic. And she would toddle around. She was very precocious. And family planning officials, about 10 of them, came in one day when the aunt was home alone with the baby and grabbed her. They immobilized the aunt, held her legs, took the baby, put the baby in the back of a car that was, down in the area where the road still worked. And the aunt, and actually most of the villagers tried to catch them, but they couldn't. And the aunt told me later, she ran after the car, but she had no shoes, couldn't catch the car. So the mom told me when I heard this story, this was 2009, she said, I don't know what happened to my daughter. I think, we've heard, there's a lot of, going back to superstition, there's a lot of rumors in China. We think she was like sold for her body parts or organs. We think she's probably dead. I didn't think this was the case. I thought she'd probably been adopted because there was, these stories about the orphanage. So I started to investigate. I went back to my office in Beijing and I started investigating. And, these adoptions were not completely, just people handing over babies. The law required that the local government, keep in mind, these orphanages are run by the government, they're social welfare institutes. The law required that the government put an ad in newspapers saying there's we found this baby on the steps of the courthouse or here or there, and we can't find her parents until now. Nobody ever saw these newspapers. This is like this one, I think it's from Guizhou, but they were like in legal newspapers. I mean, you didn't get these newspapers in the villages, and even if you did, you didn't. These parents had very marginal literacy, but this was the system. So again, I told you this story is sort of about social media, and it's about social media in the US too, because in 2009, this is still 2009, Americans who were much more innocent about social media and its implications put had no compunctions about putting pictures of their kids online. And especially, if you have like a cute little girl, I mean, really, how can you resist? These girls were, young, they were sweet, and there were pictures all over Facebook and Yahoo of, these little girls sort of partaking in the joys of American life, riding ponies, decorating Christmas trees, dancing the Nutcracker. The pictures were all over the place. And the families had organized themselves by the adoptive families, by orphanage, because a lot of adoptive families raised money to contribute to the orphanages. And this family, or I thought that the girl had gone to Shaoyang orphanage. Shaoyang was the closest big city. And so I got into a Yahoo Friends of Shaoyang Orphanage group, and I looked at the photos of girls. And, I had I knew when the kid was taken. I had a pretty good sense of where she was taken, to the Shaoyang orphanage. And I also knew what she looked like because I had met her 9-year-old twin. And, babies tend to look sort of alike, but by the time they're, a few years old, their facial features are distinct. And so I found this one family. They were evangelical Christians from Texas, and they had actually started a little NGO called Adopt the World. And it was, very religiously motivated. Jesus wants you to rescue these orphans. There's, millions of abandoned babies in China. We have to find them a home. And this couple had posted 2 photos of their daughter on the site. One was as a baby, and the other was as she was when they found her. Another was a few years old. And I thought, gosh, this could be the right girl. And so I plucked these photos off of the internet, and I made what looked, was sort of like a police lineup or mugshots. And I put the photos in among other random photos. And I said, these are, adopted kids. Do any of them look like they could be, your daughter? And they picked out the 2 correct pictures immediately. You can see the handwriting. Zong was the family name. You can see the baby, and you can see the girl a few years old. They were sure immediately. They wrote back to me immediately. And then I was like, oh no, what do I do now? Because people have said to me, oh, you must have been so proud of yourself, but I actually wasn't, because I thought I'm mucking around in here, and I hadn't really thought through the consequences. And the adoptive family was, incredibly upset. I had read, published these stories, not about them, but, about the whole phenomenon. And they had seen the pictures of the twin looking for her, this video of the twin who's looking for her sister. And they knew that they had the twin. And they were very upset. And through an intermediary, they contacted me, and I contacted them, and I said, don't worry, I'm not going to write anything. Here's the information I have. I sent them my photos and videos and, the information I had, and said, this was a 9-year-old girl. I couldn't out her as a stolen twin. And that was it. This was 2009. A little bit more on this. I don't know if you can you read this? This was the information they had gotten. Shafu Chen, female, born June 8th, 2000, was found abandoned at the gate of Chowto Bamboo Craft Factory. The child was picked up by blah, blah, blah. We cannot find her natural parents and other relatives up till now. This was, a complete fabrication. But this is what the family was told. And oops, that didn't come out very well, but anyway, so this is where story should have ended in 2009. I identified her. I contacted the family in Hunan province and I said, I think your daughter is alive and well and living in the United States. She's young. I don't think you can contact her right now, but maybe in the future. They were actually very nice about it. They said they were happy to have the photos, that I should, tell them if I learned more, if it changed. 2009, flipped the calendar to 2017, January 2017, and this is the opening of the book. It was like the week after Donald Trump's first inauguration. I was living in New York. I was covering New York City for the LA Times. It was a very chaotic period. I was exhausted and very busy. And I got a message on Facebook. Again, I'm telling you, social media, from a man in Michigan who was a car dealer, didn't have a car at that time, saying, you had asked me long ago about my sister. Are you still interested? I was like, who? What? This was the older half-brother of the adopted girl. I had contacted everybody in the family. The couple who had adopted her were older. They had adult children from a previous marriage. And I was like, yeah, I'm interested. Anyway, they had contacted me because, as I found out, talking to them, the girl was at that time 16, and she was saying she wanted to meet her or be in contact with her identical twin. And the family wanted to know if I would help them. And it was a very strange thing because they didn't really trust the adoption agency. They trusted me because I had kept the secret for so many years. I mean, I didn't really have a choice, but okay, this is the family. Marcia and Al, her husband, by the time I got involved, he was deceased. The baby, who was known as Fang Fang, whose name was changed to Esther, and another girl who was adopted from China named Victoria. This was the family. And they lived in, again, very rural Texas. And so I started, this is, where I got involved, and I started to help. I tracked down Shuangjia, that little girl you saw earlier. She was, had just finished sort of middle school and was working as a trainee at a kindergarten in Changsha. Changsha is the capital of Hunan province. And I contacted her and she said, can we be in touch? Esther, the American twin, did not want to reveal where she was or any great details, but she wrote a letter. And I was going to put up the letter, but I thought it was too intrusive. If you want to know what's in the letter, you could read the book. But they started like a pen pal relationship, and a lot of it was pretty mundane. Like, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite sport? What kind of music do you like? Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, they were exchanging letters and it wasn't really going anywhere. And they didn't want to do this directly. So I was translating the letters in my not great Chinese. I kept on saying to Esther, you've got to get on, WeChat. It will translate better than I can, but she didn't want to do that. So I was on my way to China for something else. So I said, I'll go see Shuangjia and let's do a video call. And we did a series of video calls. She didn't have a MacBook. That was my MacBook in a hotel in Changsha. And, they spoke for a couple of hours. I brought in a professional interpreter, a journalist friend of mine. And again, it was full of misunderstandings and mistranslations. it's just, there's just too many, but it was like clear they didn't really understand each other. And Esther had sent some gifts for Shuangjie, and Shuangjie wouldn't open them because traditionally in China, you don't open the gifts when you get them. It was just all sorts of stuff, but it was okay. And they were really excited. And then I thought, wow, maybe I'll go to the village. So I went to the village and I needed to get, I really needed a DNA test. And I had taken a cheek swab from Shuangjie. And I asked the father if he would sign off on it. And I showed him the photos that I had of Esther and who they called Feng Feng. And he was really pleased. And this is him looking at the photos. He was just really happy. And the midwife who had delivered the twins was really happy. And we got the DNA test and, it showed that they were identical twins. And I went to see Esther and her family in Texas. And it turned out that Esther really liked Chinese food. And she had learned they lived in a very small town where there were no Chinese restaurants. I mean, unbelievable. Is there a town in America without Chinese restaurants? This town had no Chinese restaurants. And so she was cooking Chinese food. She was wonderful. Her mother, Marcia, who's there on the left, was wonderful. And we talked and talked and talked. And I showed Esther the photo of her father looking at the photo of her. And she was like, can you help me go to China? And I thought, well, they had told me early on they didn't want to, they weren't sure that they wanted anything written. And I was like, I'm just doing this to help you. And I really was just doing it to help. And I said, I could maybe get the LA Times to pay for some of it if I could write something. And I said, you can think about it. And we discussed very, very carefully, what I could write. And, they didn't want an exploitative thing. There had been identical twins who had been revealed on Good Morning America. And it was this goofy thing where they were wearing the same pink outfits and they pulled a curtain, and they didn't want any of that. They wanted something very subdued, but they said I could write and I could photograph. And I helped raise money. My publisher raised some money, and this one. Sorry. I think. Okay. I don't know if we can turn off the sound for a minute because you need to see this one. You don't have to actually.
Okay, let me see. Let me try playing it first. How this works.
Guangzhou at the village. The elder sister. Marcia, the mom. The half brother. This whole thing was very weird. It was very subdued. I had covered a couple of reunions before, and I thought people were going to be falling on the floor and crying and this and that. And as I got to know these people, this was just not the way they were. They were really low key. And actually, the twins for like a long time, just like wouldn't really look at each other. So we went into the in the house. This was those of you who know China would understand this. This was during the Lunar New Year, That's why you have all the red wrappers from the fireworks, and we had picked this time carefully because the everybody would be home. And, they just like had a hard time talking to each other. It was really weird. But we did eat because this is China and one eats. Food was great if you're interested in such things. This house, you may gather from the photo, was not heated. Everybody was wearing their coats. This part of China doesn't have central heating. Another long story, but we ate. And eventually, Esther is a photographer, and eventually she showed Shuangjie her camera, and it just slowly started to ease up. We went to see the aunt. This is the woman in the pink, is the aunt who took care of her when she was a baby, and she's the one who was actually immobilized when they took her. This was actually a really nice moment. Sanhua, the mother in the red coat, said she would bring her twins and her older daughters to the bamboo grove where the twins were born. And here we are walking to the bamboo grove. This is also a video, but I don't think you have to see it. This was a group picture of the family. There were assorted relatives there for the Lunar New Year. The person on the far right with the orange scarf is me. This is like a family shrine. We went to visit the orphanage. We didn't stay there very long because we thought we'd get arrested. But this was very interesting because these orphanages had gotten very wealthy from this $3,000 a baby scheme. And this orphanage looked like, like a five-star hotel from the outside, and the inside was pretty nice too. There were no children there who were disabled. And this is 2019. China had gotten rich. People were not abandoning their children, sometimes special needs kids, but just wasn't happening. So I found this photo very interesting because, towards the end of the trip, I really started thinking about twins and twinship, and there's a lot of what are called twin studies. There's a whole interdisciplinary school of twin studies looking at, the whole nature versus nurture, the role played by genetics, and it's very political and very controversial because a lot of it is like, are some people genetically superior? It's a whole touchy thing. I have a whole chapter on twin studies. There's the largest school of this is in Fullerton, California. But this was the two twins. This was later. We went after we left the village. We drove back to Changsha with Shuangjie, and the twins spent some time together. And I love this photo because they had switched clothes with each other and did each other's makeup. And, they didn't look that much alike when they were, in their own clothes and their own environments, but when they switched clothing and makeup, you could see their differences were really cosmetic. And they had a lot in common. They're both artistic, both really like to cook and eat. There was this question that everybody kept on asking, which is, which twin is better off? And it was interesting right before the trip. I don't know if you can read this. Imagine you have to make a bet. There are two 18-year-olds, one in China, the other in the United States. both poor and short on prospects. Well, this was exactly the case with these twins, both 18-year-olds. And the New York Times story, I mean, this ran just like months before our trip in 2019. So I think it ran in December 2018. This story concluded that there was more social mobility in China than the US, contrary to what people might think. And this was very interesting to me because, and to the twins themselves, because there's always this, and adoptees hate this, they're always told, adoptees who come to the US, oh, you're so lucky, you're lucky, you're lucky. And, this is in a way American exceptionalism. Are you so lucky to be American? Maybe yes, maybe no. But in the case of these two families, I thought maybe the Chinese family was wealthier than the American family because, you remember the photo of the log cabin where I saw them in 2019. This is their house. This is their house in 2019. They were building this big 3-story house. I mean, the 3rd story was sort of an aspiration, but all the members of the family were working, doing migrant work. They had all this land. They were farming. They had their own rice, their own vegetables. Shuangjie was working, in this kindergarten. She was in Changsha, which is a really nice city. And, she was kind of launched. And Esther, who had been homeschooled, was living in rural Texas, did occasional work as a supermarket cashier, had never been to college or really high school. I thought the Chinese twin was actually, living a somewhat better life. The adoptive father had died. And, although they had a very loving mother, when her husband was sick with cancer, the family, typical American story, not quite enough health insurance, childcare too expensive. The mother had stopped working to take care of her husband and girls. And I don't know, then things changed again, as they do. There's this up and down with China and the US. And, our trip was in 2019. What happened the next year? COVID. Initially China did very well with the COVID controls. Then it was not so great. Shuangjie's kindergarten closed down because of COVID. Then a lot of private kindergartens were closed by the government. Esther, who had this kind of like cliched Texas can-do attitude, a lot of confidence, a lot of energy, started a business as a wedding photographer and has been very successful. So, it's back and forth, back and forth. I don't know how many conclusions you can, make looking at one set of twins. But there is something of a window into China and the US through these twins and the two families. Anyway, that's it. Questions?